She stood at the edge of the Ravenscar ballroom in a gown the color of pewter, and 60 pairs of eyes moved past her as though she were a piece of furniture that had always been there and had never been remarkable. She had learned to accept that. She had learned, over 2 years of service, to stand near walls and arrange her face into something neutral and wait to be told where she was needed. What she had not yet learned, and what no one in this room suspected she was still capable of, was the feeling that came when a man crossed 50 feet of polished floor in 12 deliberate strides and stopped precisely in front of her and said her name. Not Miss Hartley. Her name. What she did not yet know, standing there in the pewter gown with the altered hem, was that the man had been watching her for 11 weeks, and that everything about to change had started with a question so simple she had almost not bothered to answer it. She had arrived at Ravenscar House on a Tuesday morning in October when the London plane trees were shedding their bark in pale strips and the street smelled of coal smoke and the coming cold. Her trunk was not large. It held 4 gowns, 2 of them remade from her mother's things, a set of primers and teaching texts she had acquired over 3 years of previous service, and, wrapped in a length of flannel at the bottom, 6 books of her own. She had counted the weight of the trunk against the cost of a cartage boy and decided to carry one side herself. The cartage boy was 12 and very kind about it. She had £36 per year, of which £42 per term was owed for her brother Gideon's school fees. The arithmetic of this was not lost on her. She had been doing it in her head since their father died 18 months ago, and she had found no solution that did not involve her continued employment, her continued silence, and her continued willingness to be whatever a household required of a governess, and nothing more. The butler at Ravenscar House was a man named Soames, and he showed her to the schoolroom with the brisk efficiency of someone who had shown many governesses to many schoolrooms and had never found the exercise interesting. The schoolroom was on the 3rd floor, north-facing, with a window that looked onto the mews. There was a small fireplace and a desk and a low chair beside it, and on the low chair sat a boy of 7 who was holding a mechanical horse made of tin and regarding Edwina with an expression of polite wariness. His name was Thomas. He was the son of Edmund Ashworth's late brother, and he had been ward to the Earl of Ravenscar for 14 months, since the carriage accident that took both his parents on a Derbyshire road in late summer. He had not spoken much since then, according to Soames, who said this in the manner of a man reporting a deficiency in a piece of equipment. The boy had not spoken much. He was otherwise well. Edwina set her teaching texts on the desk. She did not speak to Thomas immediately. She moved to the window and looked out at the mews, where a groom was walking a gray horse in slow circles. She said, without turning, that she had once known a gray horse named Cardigan, who had belonged to her father, and who had been sold when the estate debts were settled. She said she had thought Cardigan was the most beautiful horse she had ever seen until she was 16, and read Xenophon's description of the perfect cavalry horse, and discovered that Cardigan had a neck entirely wrong for the passage. Thomas said nothing for a moment. Then he said that he had read Xenophon. Edwina turned from the window. He was watching her with the same polite wariness, but something in it had shifted slightly to one side. She said that he was 7 years old, and that Xenophon was not typically on a primer list for 7-year-olds. He said that his uncle had read it to him. She asked which parts. He told her. It was a beginning. Lady Dorothea Ashworth, Dowager Countess of Ravenscar, came to inspect the schoolroom on Edwina's 3rd day. She arrived without announcement, the way she arrived in all rooms, because a woman of her standing had no reason to announce herself in her own son's household. She stood in the doorway in a gown of deep bronze silk and looked at Edwina the way one looks at a piece of furniture one suspects might be the wrong size. Thomas was at his letters. Edwina had her back to the door and was pointing to a passage in a primer when she felt the particular quality of silence that meant a person of consequence had entered a space. She turned and curtsied, and said, "Good morning, my lady." Lady Dorothea looked at the primer, then at the ink on Thomas's fingers, then at Edwina's gown, which was the brown one remade from her mother's wool, with new buttons. She said that the previous governess had kept the schoolroom in better order. Edwina looked at the schoolroom. It was in order. Thomas's books were stacked by subject. The slates were clean. The primer was open at the correct page. She said that she was happy to address any specific concern her ladyship might have. Lady Dorothea said that she had no specific concerns. She said that a governess and nothing more was what the household required, not a disputant. She said this pleasantly, with the polish of a woman who had refined her slights to the point where they were almost indistinguishable from advice. She left without waiting for a reply. Thomas looked at his letters. Edwina looked at the primer. Neither of them said anything for a moment. And then Edwina asked him to read the next passage aloud, and he did, carefully, with the particular concentration of a child who has learned that concentration is a reliable shelter. She did not meet the Earl of Ravenscar until her 5th day. He was in the corridor outside the library on the 2nd floor. A tall man in a dark coat stopped at the window in a posture that suggested he had been there for some time and had not found what he was looking for in the view. She was returning Thomas to the schoolroom after an hour in the gardens. Thomas said, "Good morning, Uncle Edmund," in his careful voice. The man turned. He was not what she had expected. Though she had not spent much time forming expectations, his face was the kind that the fashionable world would have called severe, and that she recognized as something different. A face that had stopped trusting the outward value of its own expressions sometime in the recent past. His eyes were the color of smoke over water, and they moved to her with a brief precision that was neither warm nor cold, but simply attentive, the way a man looks at something he has not classified yet. Soames had introduced her to the household accounts on her first day. It had not occurred to anyone that she should be introduced to the Earl. Thomas said, "This is Miss Hartley, my governess. She came from a good family in Wiltshire. She knows Xenophon." The Earl looked at his ward for a moment, with an expression that could not quite have been called amusement, but that occupied some small space adjacent to it. He said good morning to Edwina. She curtsied and said, "Good morning, my lord," and took Thomas back to the schoolroom, and did not think about the quality of that brief attentive look until later. Alone. When she was relying on her not thinking about it. October deepened. Thomas began to speak more. He told her about the carriage accident with the directness of a child who has been told that speaking of a thing is better than carrying it silently, and who is still testing whether this is true. He told her his mother had smelled of lavender water, and that his father had known the names of every tree on the Ravenscar Derbyshire estate. He told her that his Uncle Edmund had come to fetch him from Derbyshire himself, which he had not expected, because his Uncle Edmund was very busy. She listened. She answered when he asked her things. She did not offer her own grief about her father, though it was near at hand, and familiar. She began waking early, before the household, to have the library to herself for an hour. Soames had told her on her first day that the library was available for her use in support of Thomas's education. She suspected this was a wider permission than Lady Dorothea had intended, and she used it without apology. The library at Ravenscar House was on the 2nd floor and contained approximately 400 volumes, though she had not yet counted them. The shelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls, and the 4th wall was glass that looked over the garden, and in the early morning before the city woke properly, with a single candle and the fire built up from the previous night's coals, it was the most orderly, the most abundantly well-provisioned room she had ever occupied in her life. She read what she wanted, not what was proper for a governess, not what would have been appropriate on the shelf of a woman without means. She read Hume, and she read Johnson, and she read a French novel she found behind a set of Gibbon that she suspected had been put there deliberately by someone with good taste and some need for concealment. She read slowly, with the specific pleasure of a person who has been made to feel that pleasure of this kind is not for her, and who is therefore going to take it anyway. On the morning of the 4th week, she was reading aloud. She had not intended to do this. Thomas had appeared at 6 in the morning in his nightgown, having woken from a dream he would not describe, and she had brought him to the library and wrapped him in a blanket by the fire, and opened the book she had been reading. A History of Natural Philosophy, with a chapter on the behavior of light through glass that Thomas had decided, on sight of the diagrams, that he urgently needed to understand. So she was reading aloud about refraction, and Thomas was asleep against her arm with his tin horse clenched in one hand, when she became aware that there was someone standing in the doorway. She had been a governess long enough to know that the quality of silence in a room changes when it is witnessed. She felt the change before she saw him. She looked up. The Earl of Ravenscar stood in the library doorway, with one hand on the frame and his coat not yet fully dressed, as though he had come from his own rooms in the early hours, for the same reason she had, and had not expected to find the library occupied. He was very still. He was watching her with the same attentive precision she had seen in the corridor. But the brief controlled quality of it was gone. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he has been looking for without knowing he was looking. She did not move. She held the book. Thomas breathed steadily against her arm. Then Edmund straightened, and the composed severity came back to his face like a gate closing, and he gave her the smallest inclination of his head and withdrew. She stayed until Thomas woke. She did not try to name what she had felt during those 30 seconds in which the Earl of Ravenscar had stood in the doorway and looked at her as though she were a sentence in a language he had given up expecting to hear spoken aloud. She encountered him later that same morning in the corridor outside the schoolroom. He had been speaking with Soames, and the conversation had evidently concluded, and he turned as she came down the passage with Thomas's morning tray in her hands, because the kitchen maid had not come up yet, and she had gone down herself rather than wait. He looked at the tray. He said, "I will send someone." She said that it was no trouble. He said, "I will send someone," with a precision that made it clear this was not a request. She understood he was telling her that she was not to be made to fetch trays. She was not sure how to respond to being protected in a register that sounded identical to being commanded. She said that she was grateful, my lord. He said, "Miss Hartley?" He paused. "I believe I interrupted your reading this morning." She said that he had not interrupted, that Thomas had fallen asleep before she had reached the more interesting passages. A second passed. He said, "Do you read often?" She said she did. A shorter pause. He said, "What do you read?" No one in 2 years of service had asked her this. She had stopped expecting to be asked. She looked at him and held the tray and said that she had been reading the natural philosophers recently for Thomas's benefit, but that left to her own judgment she tended toward the historians and toward certain novelists she would not like to name in case they reflected poorly on her taste. He said, "Name one." She named the French novel she had found behind the Gibbon. Something moved in his face. Not quite the near amusement she had seen before. Something quieter and more costly than that. He looked at her for a moment longer than propriety required. Then he said, "Good day, Miss Hartley," and went down the corridor. And she stood with the breakfast tray and understood, with a certainty she could not account for, that something in the preceding 90 seconds had been significant. She carried the tray upstairs and told herself it was not. November arrived, and with it, Miss Cecily Vane. Miss Vane was everything Lady Dorothea had ordered. 23 years old, polished to the degree that the light almost caught on her, with a dowry that Soames mentioned to the upstairs maid at a volume Edwina was apparently not meant to overhear, and a manner so confidently gracious that it had clearly never occurred to her to practice it, because it had never needed practice. She arrived for a fortnight's visit with her mother and a maid and 3 trunks, and she arranged herself in the drawing-room as though it had been built to receive her. Lady Dorothea called Edwina to the drawing-room on Miss Vane's second morning. This was unusual. Edwina arrived with Thomas, who had been invited to present himself to the company, and stood near the door, while Thomas was admired by the ladies, in the careful way ladies admire children they have no particular feeling for. Then Lady Dorothea said to Mrs. Vane that Thomas was a sweet boy, well enough managed for a child in the care of a governess, and nothing more. A woman without the refinements a family of Ravenscars standing truly required, but serviceable, quite serviceable. One made do with what one could secure at short notice. Mrs. Vane made a sound of sympathetic understanding. Edwina did not look at her own hands. She looked at Thomas, who was looking at his tin horse. She said, in a voice she had spent 2 years calibrating to carry no more weight than was absolutely necessary, "Shall I take Thomas upstairs, my lady?" Lady Dorothea said yes. "Do." Edwina took Thomas upstairs. On the landing he said quietly that he did not like Miss Vane. She said that he did not need to like her. He needed only to be civil to her. He said, "Do you like her?" She said that it was not her place to say. He considered this. Then he said that he thought Miss Vane's eyes were the wrong shape for someone who was supposed to marry his Uncle Edmund, because his Uncle Edmund's eyes were serious eyes, and Miss Vane's eyes were the kind that did not look at things very long. Edwina said nothing to this. She opened his primer and pointed to the day's passage, and he sat down, and she stood at the window for a moment and looked at the mews and thought about the wrong shape of eyes, and then stopped thinking about it, because it was not a thought she could afford. She was given a note by the understanding that if you want to stay on the channel for more stories like this one, a quiet comment is all it takes. But we will leave the note here and return to Edwina, because what happened next was the thing the drawing-room visit had been designed to prevent. Edmund had begun appearing at the library door in the early mornings, not entering, standing in the doorway for a moment, sometimes exchanging a word with Thomas, once asking Edwina what chapter they had reached and staying to hear her answer in a way that suggested the chapter was not the real question. She noticed that he did not enter the room when Thomas was asleep. He waited until the boy stirred, or she looked up. She told herself this was courtesy. She told herself many things with great conviction during November, and believed fewer of them each week. She knew about the wound before he told her. She knew about it the way you know about a structural feature of a house you have lived in long enough, not from being shown it, but from noticing the spaces where a wall is load-bearing and the whole building leans slightly toward it. He did not talk about his late wife, but he did certain things. He kept a writing desk in a room adjacent to the library, and she had seen, through the open door, the quantity of paper there, filled not with estate accounts, but with letters. She had seen him fold a letter, address it, and set it aside in a way that suggested it was going nowhere. She had seen Thomas ask him once, in the offhand way children ask questions that shatter windows, whether his uncle had loved Aunt Charlotte, and had seen Edmund's face go very still, the way a man goes still when the answer is complicated in a direction he will not explain to a 7-year-old. What she learned she learned in November's third week, in the library. When Thomas had gone to his afternoon lesson with the music master, and she had stayed to return the books they had used. Edmund had come in without the quality of care he sometimes took to mark his presence, and when he found her alone, he did not withdraw, but sat in the chair by the window, in the way a man sits when he has been carrying something for a long time, and the room is empty enough to set it down. He said, "I used to write letters from the war, from the peninsula. 3 years of them." She said nothing. She held the Gibbon she had been shelving and waited. He said, "She did not read them. I do not know if she could not or would not. I was told she had been unwell. When I came back, she was already gone from a fever, and her maid told me, as a kindness, I think, that the letters had been kept. I found them in a box, unopened. Every one of them." He was looking out the window. His jaw was the kind that holds its shape under pressure by long practice. He said, "I had thought for a long time that I had simply written to no one, that the act of writing was a habit I maintained in the absence of any actual recipient." Edwina set the Gibbon on the shelf, carefully, so that it did not make noise. She said, "What did you write about?" He looked at her. She thought he had not expected to be asked that either. He said, "The landscape. The birds were different. I found I kept wanting to tell someone what the birds were like." She said very quietly, "The bird life of the Iberian Peninsula is extraordinary. There are species of vulture that do not exist in England." He was quiet for a long moment. Something happened in his expression that she did not have a word for. Something that was not the near amusement of the corridor or the controlled severity of the drawing room, but was instead the face of a man who has heard, after a long silence, a sound he had stopped expecting to hear. He said, "Yes, exactly that." She returned to the schoolroom 10 minutes later and sat down at the desk and looked at her hands on the primer for a long time before she could bring herself to open it. The dismissal came on the morning of the Ravenscar Winter Ball, which was 3 weeks later. It was Lady Dorothea who delivered it, in the housekeeper's room, with Mrs. Fields present as a witness of some kind, and it was delivered in the manner of a household correction rather than a personal one, which was perhaps the thing Edwina found hardest to absorb. The season was concluding. Miss Vane's engagement was to be announced at the ball. The household's requirements were changing. A governess of Thomas's particular sensitivities needed qualifications that perhaps Edwina did not possess. There would be a week's wage in lieu of notice. A week's wage. £36 divided by 52 weeks. She had done this arithmetic before, but never quite like this, in the housekeeper's room with the smell of beeswax and Mrs. Fields looking at the floor. Lady Dorothea said, "A governess and nothing more is no longer what this household requires." The third time, the same words, the same pleasant, polished delivery. Edwina said that she understood. She walked upstairs and stood in the passage outside Thomas's room and thought about Gideon's fees. £42, which she did not have, which she would not have, which she could not arrange in a week without returning to her previous employer in Wiltshire and asking on terms she did not want to consider. She thought about Thomas, 7 years old, in a nightgown at dawn with a tin horse in his hand and a dream he would not describe. She thought about the box of unopened letters in a house in Derbyshire. Then she went into Thomas's room and sat down in the chair by his bed and told him, quietly and plainly, that she was leaving the household the following week and that a new governess would be arranged for him. Thomas said, "When?" She said, "Soon. Within the week." He said, "Will she read to me?" She said, "Yes. Good governesses always read to their charges." He said, "What if she does not know which chapter we are at?" She said, "Then you will show her." He looked at his tin horse. He said, "I do not want you to go, Miss Hartley." She said she knew. She said he was going to be perfectly all right. She said this with a conviction that she did not feel, and that she was going to maintain until she was alone somewhere and could stop maintaining it. She sat with him until he fell asleep. She sat with him through the evening, while the household below prepared for the ball, while the candlelight shifted and the sound of carriages began in the street. And she told herself she was staying until she was certain he was settled, that she was not staying because she had no other place to go, that she was not staying because going down the stairs and out the door in her plain brown wool while 60 people arrived in satin and diamonds was a thing she found she could not do on the same evening. Lady Dorothea had used that phrase for the 3rd time. She read to him. He slept. She read to herself. She heard the ball begin below. She heard the footman on the stairs, the particular cadence of guests arriving, the music starting in the lower rooms. She sat in the chair by Thomas's bed with a candle on the table and a book in her hands, and told herself that this was a dignified way to spend an evening. Edmund found her there at 9:30. He did not knock, because the door was already open. He stood in the doorway in his formal clothes, white cravat and dark coat, and the bearing of a man to whom the social architecture of a ball is a thing he administers rather than enjoys. And he looked at her in the chair beside his sleeping ward and at the candle and the open book and said nothing for a moment. She rose. She said, Thomas was unsettled. She was sorry to have stayed so long. He said, Thomas was unsettled, or you were unsettled on his behalf? She said, both, perhaps. He said, my mother told me this afternoon that she had given you notice. She said that she had been given a week. He said, she did not have that authority. Something went very still inside her chest. She said, my lord, she is the mistress of the household. He said with a quietness that had the texture of absolute certainty in it. She is my mother. This is my household. Thomas is my ward. And you, Miss Hartley, have made Thomas speak in full sentences again, after 14 months of mostly not speaking, and I will not have you given a week's wage in the housekeeper's room and sent away for having done so. She did not trust her voice entirely. She said, what do you intend, my lord? He said, I intend to go downstairs and tell 60 people something true, and I would like you to come. She looked at him. She looked at Thomas, still asleep with the tin horse on the pillow. She looked at her own hands, which were the hands of a woman who had remade her mother's gowns and carried her own half of a trunk and done the arithmetic of 42 pounds against 36 for 18 months, without anyone asking how she was managing. She said, the pewter gown is the best I have. He said, I know. If you have found yourself holding your breath in a library doorway over a story like this one, you are precisely the listener this story was made for, and a comment below costs nothing at all. She went to her room and changed into the pewter gown and pinned her hair as well as she could without a maid's assistance, and went down the main staircase of Ravenscar House at 9:45 in the evening of the Ravenscar Winter Ball, and stepped into the doorway of the ballroom, and understood why 60 was a great many people when you were wearing pewter among diamonds. The room was lit with 100 candles at least, reflected in the gilt mirrors that lined the east wall, and the sound of it was the particular layered sound of London society in full exercise, the music from the quartet in the corner, the percussion of conversation, the specific interval of laughter calibrated to be heard and not overheard. Lady Dorothea stood near the fireplace in deep amber silk, with Miss Vane arranged at her side like a proof of something, and she saw Edwina in the doorway with an expression that moved through surprise into a very particular quality of certainty, the certainty of a woman who knows the room and has never been wrong about it. Edwina stood at the edge. She had stood at the edges of rooms for 2 years. She knew the topology of periphery. Edmund came in behind her, and he did not stop at the edge. He moved through the room with the directness of a man who has decided something and has no interest in the intervening social distance. She watched, rather than felt, the shift in the room's attention as he moved, the way a current moves through water when something large and deliberate passes through it. Conversations paused. Heads turned. Lady Dorothea's hand stilled on her fan. He stopped in front of Edwina. The room was very attentive. He said in a voice pitched for carrying, "Miss Edwina Hartley." He said it as though the two words were a statement with legal force, which perhaps in the context of 60 witnesses it was. He said, "You came down." She said, "You asked me to." He said, "I did." He looked at her for a moment with the attentive, unhurried quality she had first seen in the corridor, and had spent 11 weeks not misreading, and then misreading, and then refusing to name. He said, "Thomas is asleep?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Good. Then I would ask you to remain." He turned, very slightly, to address the assembled room without raising his voice, because his voice at this register required no raising. He said, "Miss Hartley is Thomas's governess, and she will continue in that position, and in due course in a position of rather more consequence in this household, if she will consent to it." He turned back to her. He said, "Will you?" She was aware of Lady Dorothea across the room. She was aware of Miss Vane's stillness, the particular stillness of someone whose script has just been removed from her hands. She was aware of 60 faces in the candlelight, and of the music having stopped, and of the fire in the grate beside her, and of her own hands, which were steady. She said, "Yes." It was a short word. It was the word the room had been waiting for, or half the room, and the other half was rearranging itself around the surprise of it. And Lady Dorothea was standing very still with her fan held at an angle she had not intended, and Miss Vane was looking at Edmund with the expression of someone who has just understood that she had never been in the room he had actually been inhabiting. The quartet in the corner started again, because musicians understand that music is the correct response to a moment of social significance when no one is entirely sure what else to do. Edmund offered Edwina his hand. She looked at it. She thought, briefly and irrelevantly, of Xenophon and the correct conformation of a cavalry horse, and of a grey called Cardigan who had had entirely the wrong neck. She thought of a box of letters in a house in Derbyshire, every one of them sealed. She thought of Thomas at dawn with his tin horse, and his careful question, "Will she read to me?" She put her hand in Edmund's. Lady Dorothea moved through the room a quarter of an hour later, and stopped before them with the precision of a woman who has spent her life performing difficult social maneuvers and who knows when one is required. She looked at her son. She looked at Edwina with the careful, recalibrating look of someone who has been wrong about the size of a piece of furniture and is adjusting the whole room in her mind. She said to Edwina, "I did not know your father's name, Miss Hartley." Edwina said, "Robert Hartley of Marlborough, my lady. He was a solicitor's son who made himself a gentleman's library. He believed that reading was the only inheritance worth passing on." Lady Dorothea was quiet for a moment. She said, "I see." And then she said, "You read to Thomas." Edwina said she did. Lady Dorothea looked at her son one more time with the expression of a woman who has been overruled by something she cannot entirely condemn, and inclined her head and moved away. It was not a warm thing. It was not intended to be warm. It was the acknowledgement of a woman who protects the order she was raised inside, and who has just been shown, by the order's own representative, that she had misread the evidence. Miss Vane left the ball early, with her mother, in a carriage that Soames arranged with the quiet efficiency of a man who has arranged many such departures. Edmund took Edwina in to supper. He did not speak much during supper. He handed her things. He made sure she had wine, and that she had a chair with a clear view of the room, and that no one approached her with condescension in a way that was not immediately corrected by his presence. He did all of this in the register of command that she had spent 11 weeks decoding as something other than coldness, and she sat beside him and let herself be looked after for the first time in a very long time, and felt the odd, alarming warmth of it. After supper, he asked her if she was tired. She said, "A little." He said, "Thomas will wake early." She said, "He always does." He said, "Miss Hartley." He waited. He said, "Edwina." Her name in his voice was a particular thing. It had the same quality as the corridor question, as the library doorway, as the answer about the birds of the peninsula. It was a thing that had been said carefully, after long consideration of whether to say it. She said, "Yes." He said, "I wrote a great many letters that were never read." He said it without particular emphasis, in the level register of a man making an observation. He said, "I find I would like, very much, to talk to someone who reads." She said, "I find I would like, very much, to hear what you wrote about." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The birds were only one subject." She said, "I have time." Gideon's school fees were arranged the following week, settled directly from the Ravenscar account through a brief, practical, entirely unsentimental conversation in which Edmund asked Edwina the specific figure, and she told him £42 per term, and he wrote to the school that same afternoon. She protested once. He said that it was not generosity, it was arithmetic. The ward of an earl required a governess of intelligence and learning, and a governess of intelligence and learning required the freedom to do her work without the distraction of unpayable debts, and the arrangement was therefore in the household's interest. She recognized this as the same register as "Come inside," and "Sit down," and "I will send someone." And she accepted it with the same precision with which she had accepted all his commands that were actually protections, and said, "Thank you, my lord." And he said, "Edmund." She said, "Edmund." He said, "Yes, that is better." Winter came fully to London. The ball's 60 witnesses dispersed into the season's gossip, which is to say that the thing Edmund had said was repeated and refined and embellished until it had taken on the specific fixity of a social fact, and social facts in London in 1814 were more durable than most other things. Lady Dorothea continued in residence in the household in a changed key, still present, still precise, still the woman who had arranged the whole furniture of her life around a social order that had just been rearranged around her, but quieter about it, the way a room is quieter when the loudest piece has been moved to a different position. Thomas woke on the first morning of December, looked at the snow outside the schoolroom window, and asked if they could do the natural philosophy chapter about ice, because he wanted to understand why snow was a different thing from ice when they were both made of water. Edwina said yes. She went to the library for the relevant volume. Edmund was already there. He was at the desk by the window, not in his estate agent's chair, but in the reading chair, with a book open in his lap, and he looked up when she came in with the expression she had watched him practice abandoning for 11 weeks. The controlled severity, the careful blankness. The expression was not there. What was there instead was his face. Simply his face. In the morning light, with the snow falling outside and the fire built up from last night's coals. The face of a man who has set something down that he had been carrying for a long time, and found the room around him changed. She found the volume of natural philosophy on the third shelf, and turned to go. He said, "Edwina, will you sit?" She sat. Not at the desk. Not with the primer held between them like a credentialing document. In the other reading chair, on the other side of the fireplace, with the snow falling outside and the book in her lap. He said, "I was going to read aloud, if you have a moment before Thomas wakes." She said, "What were you going to read?" He turned the book in his hands so she could see the cover. It was a collection of the natural historians, accounts of species documented in warmer latitudes, the birds and the insects, and the strange flowering things that no English winter produces. He had marked a passage with a piece of folded paper. His finger held the page. She said, "Read it then." He read. His voice was the voice she had heard in brief sentences in corridors and at supper, the level declarative voice of a man who does not perform, but reading it became something else, something slightly less defended. The voice of a man who had written letters for 3 years to a person who had not read them and who was reading, now, to a person who was. She listened. The fire crackled. The snow came down outside the window that she had learned to think of over 11 weeks as her window, because she had sat in front of it enough mornings that it had taken on the quality of a belonging. When he finished the passage, he looked up. She said, "There is another passage, 3 pages on, about the migratory patterns. It answers a question the first passage leaves open." He turned 3 pages. He found it. She said, "Read that one too." He did. Thomas found them there, an hour later, when he came downstairs in his nightgown with the tin horse and the particular expression of a child who knows before he rounds the corner that the room will contain something he wants. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at his Uncle Edmund in the reading chair, and at Edwina in the other reading chair, and at the book between them. He climbed into the space on the hearthrug between their chairs and arranged himself with the tin horse in his lap, and looked at the fire. He said, "Are you reading about the birds?" Edmund said, "Yes." Thomas said, "Will you read it again? From the beginning?" Edmund looked at Edwina. She looked at Edmund. She opened the book to the first page of the passage, smoothed the paper with one hand, and began to read aloud. The snow fell outside the window of the Ravenscar library. The fire burned. Thomas held his tin horse. Edmund sat very still in the reading chair with his hands open in his lap. And his face was not the face of a man administering a social machinery, or enduring a silence, or standing in a doorway, waiting to know whether he was permitted to stay. It was the face of a man who had finally been heard. If Edwina's story stayed with you, leave a comment with the moment that held you longest. These stories are made for listeners who know what it is to sit quietly in a room and wait to be seen. And your company here, every time you return, is precisely what makes it possible to keep telling them.